Retention in a coffee grinder? Sounds quite dramatic, and indeed it is, as it's simply old coffee from the previous grind that will impair the quality of your next brew.
Somewhat dramatic indeed. How might we prevent this? Are there various retention zones present? And are there grinders that do more or less? Of course, that's what this video is about. You remember so little?
The retention space in a coffee grinder, or what we call in German Totraum, that means dead space, the concept of retention in a coffee grinder, that's the leftover coffee in your grinder. So, when you decide to grind just once, there's always some coffee that doesn't manage to come out, staying inside. And we refer to it as coffee in the so-called retention space, but there exist various retention zones.
Absolutely. We have a retention zone that's changing, we have a retention that stays constant, we have
that comes in both,
right? And then there's this single dosing retention that gets grinded out again, but still, And in this video, we'd really like to sum that up a bit for you and show you through two specific examples what precisely that means and how you can ideally prevent it.
Let's start with the terminology, specifically the most important one, that is the temporary retention. Temporary retention.
This is the retention that gets replaced with every grinding. For instance, the Eureka Specialita has a retention of 3.1 grams. This means if you've ground coffee, you probably already had old coffee in there and you just replaced it with fresh. This means essentially there are always some coffee grounds left over in the grinding chamber as well as in the vicinity of the tunnel and the discharge area or the outlet essentially. These represent the replaceable retention that are found there.
In other words, if we're brewing coffee now, then for example if we aim for 18 grams in the dosing container or in your portafilter afterwards, we don't have 18 grams of fresh coffee, but 15 grams of fresh coffee and approximately 3 grams of rather old coffee that had just been quite comfortably tucked away right over here. And it's now been emptied out completely and then refilled with new, very fresh coffee. And this temporary retention space is incredibly crucial because after all, it ends up directly in your cup. Now, if you decide to brew a single cup, not with 18 but opting for 9 or 10 grams instead, you then end up with 3 grams of unnecessary retention, which is effectively 3 grams of old coffee. This phenomenon has a significant impact as it makes us realize coffee loses much of its complexity just 15 minutes after grinding. So, it's not at all an exaggeration. There exist several studies which say absolutely crucial and quite fascinating for the taste, indeed positive. Volatile aromas that evaporate swiftly, because at the moment when we grind the coffee, everything is broken open, and this enlarged structure or surface ensures that much of the complex volatile aromas evaporate. That's why temporary retention.
Then you encounter the permanent retention space. It's, let's just say, at the beginning, when you buy a grinder, it makes a difference, but later on, it often remains in place. This is often the case with screws, for instance. Grinding discs are often fastened with screws and not from below, as is occasionally done nowadays, but really through the grinding discs, there are often slotted screws, and in this slot, then coffee stains linger, they stay, and maybe if you clean them once, you can get them out, but they quickly come back and stay there too. And what we then add up, that becomes the total retention space when we meticulously sum up the temporary retention along with the permanent retention space.
Exactly. The permanent one, as you mentioned, isn't actually that relevant. However, if you have a huge permanent retention and then a lot of fresh coffee comes into contact with old coffee and keeps passing by it, and the old one just oxidizes over time, eventually becoming rancid and unpleasant to taste, then of course it's not tasty either. So naturally it's also important there, how much retention do we have, how much surface ends up sticking together, and then perhaps a small portion of this tightly sealed zone might just start to come loose. And I can tell you, that's when it gets really uncomfortable.
As a small addition, there is also the single dose retention space. Imagine it like this. If we have a regular functioning dosing chamber, then we test also, would it theoretically be capable for single dose? This means, is the chamber actually emptied by just grinding longer without beans in the hopper? And there are grinders that manage to get quite a lot out, where usually around the grinding chamber the majority is grinded out and only a little bit remains stuck in the chute. And then we're left with this residual value inside
Exactly, and this distinction especially comes into play when compared to grinders with bean hoppers. So single dosing grinders, bean hopper grinders, because the bean hoppers there, we can't just grind empty, because there's always coffee sitting on top. Meaning they're not really designed for that, yet we can still use them for single dosing to some extent if we just throw in the weighed beans and then everything comes out. But that's not the case with many grinders, and it's also not the case with many single dosing grinders, which is why many single dosing grinders resort to using a blow-up chamber or a clacking mechanism to release the remaining coffee.
What's important for you in this regard? First and foremost, it's crucial that if you haven't used the grinder for 15-20 minutes, you first know how much retention remains in the grinder and either grind it empty or somehow find a solution that you waste as little coffee as possible and that it's not included in the next brewing session, because it truly can make significant, impactful differences to your brew quality.
Absolutely. And perhaps there's also a way with something like a blower or so, if you're into single dosing, to then extract what's left or even to tap it out. If you have, for example, a bean container grinder so that maybe what's in the shaft can loosen up, and by the way, you also get all the coffee you want into your dosing container. Here, you see displayed a list of fairly good grinders with little retention. Grinding individual portions, meaning single dosing grinders, but also dosing grinders. Maybe just one final tip, Michelle. There's still a tip left, right? So a good tip actually starts even before grinding.
Absolutely. If you're making the coffee in your living unit, whether it's single dose, we would recommend that you store the coffee right in your bag and ideally consume it as quickly as possible. That means what's now in your open bag might be in a week. However, it's important to note that whatever is in your bean hopper really should be consumed within just one single day. That means the bean containers are, in most cases, far too large at home. Just put in what's exactly meant to be in there, what you generally drink within a single day. Then you can truly get so much more out of your coffee.
If you want to learn more about the topic and especially about the benefits of single dosing, then I recommend watching the video right up here. And of course, we're thrilled if you subscribe to the channel. Next week, we're continuing with more engaging and entertaining coffee videos, tips, tricks, reviews, and much more from the dynamic world of coffee right here with us. We're thrilled if you join us. Bye and see you soon.